Week 10 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few defenses I would start this week. The first defense, the Arizona Cardinals. So the Cardinals have a great matchup this week versus the Carolina Panthers. And Sam Darnold, he wasn't doing good, and now he's out in this ball game in a few weeks here with a shoulder injury. So former XFL standout quarterback PJ Walker is going to get the nod in this one, and it spells a disaster for Walker and this Panther offense, in my opinion, in this ball game. Coming into the game, the Panthers give up the seventh most fantasy points to defenses, and I think in this one, the Cardinals, especially that they're at home in this one, they're going to feast on the youngster Walker. This game going to get a few sacks, a few turnovers, and I think they definitely find the end zone as well. And this unit's been playing pretty well this season. The last few weeks, Week 7 versus Houston, 3 points allowed, 2 sacks, a fumble recovery, 2 fourth down stops. Week 8 versus Green Bay, 24 points allowed, a sack, 2 fourth down stops. And last week at San Francisco, a good ball game as well, 17 points allowed, 5 sacks in Intel, and 2 fumble recoveries. So this week, they're going to be a top 5 defense, no doubt about it, in my opinion, is Arizona. And they're going to get to PJ Walker early and often and have a big game. Next defense is the Baltimore Ravens. So the Ravens, their defense this season hasn't been that good. And I know they've dealt with a lot of injuries this year. So the last few weeks for this defense, Week 6 versus the Chargers, 17 fantasy points, 6 points, 2 sacks in Intel, 3 fourth down stops. Week 7 versus Cincinnati, it was a joke, 41 points allowed, a sack and interception. And then Week 9 versus the Minnesota Vikings, 31 points allowed for -1 fantasy points. But this week here, they got a slam dunk matchup at the Miami Dolphins that give up the 5th most fantasy points to DSTs on the season. So I think no matter who's starting for the Dolphins, and Tua Tagovailoa or Jacoby Brissett, I think they're good for a few sacks as this Raven defense. And they're another team that I definitely could see find the end zone in this one, and I would start them this week. The next defense is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So the Bucs here, I like a lot of Buc players, and obviously their defense in this one at a weak Washington football team that gives up the 8th most fantasy points to tight ends on the season. So this Buc defense, they're not in full gear yet this year. They've dealt with a lot of injuries and a lot of players in and out of the lineup. In the last few weeks for them, Week 7 versus the Bears, 3 points allowed, 4 sacks, 3 interceptions, 2 fumble recoveries, and a fourth down stop. Week 8 at the New Orleans Saints, 30 points allowed, a sack, and a fourth down stop. So right here, Week 10 at Washington, Taylor Heineke, we know in the playoffs last season he had a good outing versus the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But I think in this one, they're going to come out and bring the heat on them early and often in this game. They want to get back on the winning track. And we know this team had the bye week to rest up and some of these guys heal and come off injuries. So this week, I think this Buccaneer defense could be a top 5 defense and have a good game. The next defense is the Pittsburgh Steelers. So the Steelers, I mentioned this a few times last week in a few of my videos. They get stronger as the season goes on over the last few seasons. And this defense, they've been playing good D and putting up fantasy points. Week 6 versus Seattle, 20 points allowed, 5 sacks, a fumble recovery. Week 8 at Cleveland, 10 points allowed, 4 sacks, a fumble recovery, and 2 fourth down stops. And Week 9 versus the Bears, 21 points allowed, 3 sacks in Intel, and a fumble recovery. So right here, they got matchups of all matchups this week versus a weak Detroit Lion offense that gives up the 2nd most fantasy points to DST. So in this one, I think the Steelers easily get double digits in this game. They'll get to Goff early and often, a few turnovers, a few sacks, and they might possibly find the end zone as well. And the 5th and final defense I would start this week is the Indianapolis Colts. So the Colts here, that defense has been playing better as well over the last few weeks. And they got a great matchup in Week 10 here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the last few games for the Colts, Week 7 at San Francisco, 18 points allowed, 2 sacks, 2 windows, 2 fumble recoveries. Week 8 versus Tennessee, 28 points allowed, 3 sacks, 2 interceptions. And Week 9 versus the Jets, they did give up 30 points, but a lot of garbage time. The Jets were down 42-16 in that ball game at one point, but 30 points allowed anyway, 2 sacks in Intel, and a fumble recovery. But right here, Jacksonville, we know they have trouble scoring the football, and they pulled out a great victory. No doubt about it was Jacksonville in Week 9 versus the Bills, but they won the game 9-6. So right here, this offense has trouble scoring, and I think in this one, this Colt team's going to make plays on Trevor Lawrence, and they're going to have a good fantasy day. So that's a few defenses I would start for Week 10 of the fantasy football season.